Hello, everybody. Welcome again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today, we have James Ellis, Meta Nomad. James, I hope I didn't just out you or dox you or anything. Okay? That's good.
No. That's all. Everything's out there now.
That's not private information. Okay. Well, host of the Meta Nomad, host of the Hermitix Podcast, a podcast that I've been listening to for a couple of years now. And it's been fascinating to see your evolution. There's a consistent strain of continental philosophy, esotericism, peak oil, and kind of collapse stuff, deep ecology, and more recently, your conversion to Catholicism. Do you want to kind of trace out a little bit of your own journey? Also, early on, there was the accelerationist stuff. I know you were really influenced by Nick Land. There was a tweet a while back that said something like the Nick Land to Wendell Berry pipeline is very real. That perked our ears up because we're big fans of Wendell Berry. But anyway, just with all that preface, do you want to kind of lay out how your worldview has evolved and through the podcast and your readings?
I mean, yeah, you said the evolution was surprising. I mean, it's surprising to me. Like when I look back, I'm like, I don't know how I ended up here. So, but I guess it all sort of makes sense, right? But so to sort of lay out that, to give into the myth of progress and lay out that evolution, beginning with the accelerationism, which really is like just nihilism turned up to the nth degree to see what happens if we accelerate everything that's going on to the point where it collapses. And ultimately, I think most people in that sphere have realized that what we knew all along, which isn't for the individual who still has to live in the world, there's not really anywhere for you to go as an entity, right? The thing we're talking about is its own abstract thing going on. So it's you sort of like there isn't too much talk around accelerationism anymore, and I stopped talking about my own thing with zero accelerationism because I think we all just realized like, well, there's nothing more we can do with it. Just let it run its course. And off that, there was a lot of esoteric stuff, and I got into the esoteric and the occult for a while. And, I think that's sort of a thing that more and more people are going to be getting into and are getting into as still there's hesitancy to get involved in what people would consider institutional religion. So they still want to give into this idea of like modern independence and freedom. So they find the alternative spiritualities. And went through them and then just took some time out for that, and collapse was always in the background. I mean, that was always something that I was seeing, I think, and it's really turned up, especially where I am. I mean, it's clear as day now, and we'll probably get into this, but the logical loops the loops and hoops that people are jumping through to try basically prove to themselves and justify that everything is still normal are getting basically on the point of absurd where I am. And so from that, I think, Doomer Optimism is a poignant yet completely on the money title because, yeah, I mean, the Doomer thing comes first, right? You have to accept that what's going on is the end of an era, the end of a civilization, the end of the modern world, if you like, in terms of the way they foresee it. But the optimistic thing is, I think the optimistic part of it is that, I've found hope with Catholicism. I'm not here to be a missionary and push that. I mean, if it doesn't work for people, it doesn't work for people. And, that's God's will, whatever. But the optimistic part, I think, really is the untangling of. So it's like pushing out all basically the crap that modernity has taught you to believe is how things really are, and the optimistic part is removing yourself from that and moving on. So finding optimism, I think, ultimately it's been quite an ironic horseshoe, like a horseshoe theory, where right at the beginning, back to that. What you said about the Nick Land to Wendell Berry pipeline, I'd forgotten about that tweet, but there's so many people in the sphere who've quite literally done that. And really there is a horseshoe theory of the ultimate complex, nihilistic game theory, really hyper complex continental philosophy. And you go all the way around to, man, I just want to go outside and like grow some carrots and have a nice cup of coffee. Right. And it takes you all that time to be like, man, this sucks. Well, I'm just going to like, enjoy the simple things, right? And it's kind of funny that that's happened, I guess.
Yeah, for me.
So I'd be really curious. Oh, sorry, Jason, you go.
I was just going to say, for me, the Doomer Optimism, it kind of has two meanings. One is, yeah, we see kind of current civilizational collapse, and we view it, I view it very much in kind of this civilizational cycle lens, which you've talked about a lot on the podcast, and I see, hope in carving out alternative worlds within the system, but quasi separate from the system if we can. But the other way I see it is more existential, and it's more about, we're all subject to the contingencies of history. I don't know if I'm going to make it. I don't know if anyone's going to make it. Right. And so it makes everything much more vivid, much more immediate and present. And so when you talk about, sitting out in the sun, planting with your carrots and drinking a cup of coffee, like there's something that's just brings you very much to the present. It's like, wow, right now I feel peaceful. I feel, things feel vibrant, but I can't take this for granted. And so that's for me, the other, the optimism is right now. It's right now, and it's almost made possible. I mean, ideally, you could achieve that state if you were like Eckhart Tolle or something, without the doom justification. But it's kind of the backdrop of like, but right now, it's beautiful.
I mean, yeah, one comment on that, and it's probably the habit that I need to get rid of the most, which is this little device of the whatever you want to call it, device of the Antichrist, if you really want to go that far. But like, like my day's fine. My day's perfectly good. I wake up, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna have a nice coffee. Oh, the sun's out. And then, every now and again I'll go, oh, I'm just gonna like stare into this little black square. Oh, people listening, I'm on about my smartphone and people with smartphones. And then all of a sudden I see like 10 different things that I didn't need to know about. I never knew about. Me knowing about them changes absolutely nothing. I'm not pushing ignorance, but I'm pushing. I think really we need to define, already going on for a digression, but you need to like, if your local life is like a circle, and then the city life is another circle, and your country is another circle, you almost need to say like, to be honest, you don't need to know about things going on too far afield. And I'm not saying, oh, you just be ignorant of what's going on in the Ukraine as if like, oh, I don't care. It doesn't mean you don't care. But to the degree of like, as we're talking about in the present of like, yeah, I've got, I don't know, the cliche thing of like, I've got carrots to grow, I've got things to build. I've got things to build in my own life, and I want to be constructing a future like on a local level where I'm actually touching grass, quite literally. That device brings everyone down to a level where they suddenly know about a load of stuff, gets you down, and knowing that all it does is imbue you with negative emotion, which didn't need to be there, and you chose to be in it. So that's like completely out of the present from minute one of the day because of the smartphone, right? So yeah, it's a little digression.
I'd be really curious to hear your like laying out of the landscape where you are. Are you in the UK?
Yeah, I'm in the UK, but I'm in the, so it's quite funny. Every time I have someone on the podcast who's not from the UK, because I said I'm from the UK, they go, oh, whereabouts are you in London? And it makes me laugh, right? Because the UK, for anyone outside it, is now London, and outside of it is quite literally back to like almost the Marxist view, right? You have the city, and then you're in the wilderness, like where I'm living. It's just anarchic. We're living in mud huts, which I'm in the southeast, the little bit that sticks out in a little county called Norfolk, which historically is very nomadic. It's very independent. I've been reading its history lately. It's extremely independent. But because this little bit sticks out, and the UK is basically this vertical country, no one comes here. So if you come here, you don't leave, and if you come here, you're coming for a reason. There's quite literally, I mean, to the extent of how much people do not leave this place, there is like medically have to be noticed incest problems in this county, right? That it's like a real backwater place, like where I want to be. Out of the way, as far away from London as I can get. And it's complete farm. It's basically our farming belt, lovely rivers, extremely flat, and people who are very salt of the earth. So that's where I'm at. So I hate cities with a passion. I like villages and I like towns, some towns. Yeah, that's where I'm at in the UK though. Yeah.
So when you say where you are, do you mean like the UK more generally? Are you talking about city people? But like I'd be curious to hear your assessment of what's going on in people's heads, because I'm also paying really close attention to this. I'm in Uruguay, but I'm from the US and very concerned about it. and the kinds of things people are getting caught up in, the various cults, the various frenzies. I'd be curious to hear your take on what's
you
going
mean
on.
in terms of the landscape of collapse?
Yeah, and the doomer, like the doomer side, like what are people doing? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll give one very practical thing. I mean, the other day I got a lot of people in the UK have just got a rebate from the government for £150, about $200, to sort of buffer the fact that energy bills for private companies are going up, which makes zero sense to me. And it's not really that much money. I'm not looking at gift horse in the mouth, but that's where we're at really in the UK of like, right. So I don't really know what this is. It's almost like this token gesture to be like, things are fine, you know. It's weird for me that's why I sort of emphasized how peculiar Norfolk is, because and historically why it's so independent. I think you could honestly draw Norfolk's this county, and then you have Suffolk. So really they're the East Anglians. Honestly, if you put a wall up, which I'm really for independent East Anglia, put a wall up and we'll just stand around. We could be, as far as I'm concerned, we could be entirely self-sufficient, you know, right? But we're right on the coast and it's all farming land and things like that. So I'm in a position and in a place where, which it's really alien for me and weird to talk to people who perhaps don't see livestock like every day, right? So like when I drive to church, I see basically fields and farming stuff, cows, pigs, and the occasional church. Like it's very, very rural. And you should live somewhere really where you go, that's the food that I'm buying in the shop, right? And if I wanted to, I could walk to get my food quite literally from the farmer. Anywhere where you're not living like that, I just think is a historic anomaly which doesn't last very long. And we've had to burn fossil fuels. We've had to burn this finite resource to be able to do that. So where we're going on, it's difficult for me to really visualize what's going on in cities because it's such a peculiar mindset. And I'm not sort of saying our city dwellers are, these. I'm not judging them, but I think we've really overlooked what used to be quite a very clear divide between urban folk and rural folk. And I think that divide is completely still there. And I think it's in people's genes. If they've grown up, you can always tell where people have come from. And my only real experience of cities, I mean, I saw a thing on Twitter recently about sort of like a lot of people are doing these, and they really fascinate me. It's like watching another world, but you might have seen them. These people who live in New York, or they live in London, and they're like, this is what a day in New York's like for a 25-year-old. And then they're like, in the morning, I go to Frappuccino, like and then I go to a pop-up for lunch and then go to my friend's art studio. And then and the whole day is this sort of binge of entertainment, consumption. And at no point in these, where's all this coming from? And really, it's like the cities have become these sort of parasites that are ignoring their host, right? They're ignoring the wilderness for them, which is basically feeding them, because cities cannot grow food, right? That's just, and they go on about vertical farms and none of that will happen. Like, well, if you're in the city, you are reliant on everyone else. And I mean, it does sort of worry me in the years to come that you have all these people in the cities and then they are going to have to move out and learn everything else. But I mean, I do lean more towards the John Michael Greer in Dark Age America, where he says when the crap really is going to hit the fan, you will see a lot of people, pouring all their Xanax and their pills into a punch bowl and just having one last final party, because they're quite literally their value system is based off those sort of Twitter clips of like, if they can't go on cruises, if they can't go on, go to their friend's pop-up in New York where they've developed some new type of like hydrogen-based coffee or something, then their life is like meaningless to them. And that seems to be basically all they're doing. And it's a bit of a worry, because not only will you have people almost like nationally migrating to different counties and rural, but that urban-rural split will become extremely clear. So, I in a way, living in the rural area of the UK, I have connection to, within living memory, older relatives of mine used to, when they were younger, their father would go out and sometimes hunt rabbits, hunt a rabbit for dinner, come back and then pull the carrots up from the allotment, which was, the norm, right? That wasn't weird. So that's in living memory here. I don't know if it is in the city and things like that. So that's how I see it. So it's difficult for me, and it probably applies to you guys as well. Once you sort of distance yourself. The world that is collapsing, collapse now and avoid the rush. I've done a lot to collapse now and avoid the rush, as I know you both have. The other world is like, it's almost like watching a sci-fi dystopia of pretense. You're like, yeah, you don't get to do this much longer. And the way, like I said, the way they've justified what's happening, petrol prices it's just they're just hiking up the prices. Like, well, you're just saying things. Like the prices at one point are going to go up, and we're already seeing this in America. I didn't realize the price of diesel there is like $6.50. We're already seeing a lot of companies, they're not being able to really subsidize their drivers to, they can't afford to subsidize the drivers to do these long trips with supply chains, and that's where it starts to crumble. And then we're ultimately at that point of like, yeah, but we don't get any more fuel. That's not how this works. Yeah. So yeah, that was a long-winded answer to say that
was good.
Rural folk are better.
I have one comment, then Jason, you can ask a question. I'm reminded of this guy who was like screaming. I don't know if you saw this Twitter video. He was like screaming that the price of gas is $7 or more a gallon, and he was yelling at Putin. He said, Putin, we're sending you a bill. And I was
we know that wasn't a spoof,
No, we don't know, but I watched it a bunch of times because I was laughing so hard at it, and it seemed legit. But I do think that there is a thing where people are just like, they don't have like the mental models to understand what's happening. So they're just like, a lot fills into that void. Sorry, Jason.
It's a huge thing, though, to admit that. I mean, even I imagine for us, it's a huge thing to admit that this world won't be like this much longer. I mean, because from day one, modernity is this very, that's why I always push internal exit of trying to sort of scrape out the rust and dirt that modernity has put on you, where you begin to understand that. And well, maybe I often think of this in terms of food, actually. Like in the UK, one way I tell people to collapse down, avoid the rush is like, just start eating seasonally. It's probably going to be fairly dull. In the UK, you're going to be eating a lot of meat stews, but just the idea that people aren't going to be able to get avocados, right? That's a very common one, but it's like, I walk into a supermarket and you think there's like tropical fruit here in December. Like this isn't this. You don't get this anymore. It's not going to be awful, but just get used to the reality that there has always been. But then people will think you're being sort of ridiculous or whatever. So they can, there you go.
Well, I'm a case study of somebody who kind of shifted their orientation. I mean, when you were describing the person in the highly urban area who's like, kind of gets their satisfaction from checking out all the new events, right? The new coffees, the art studio, like that whole description resonated with me. And for me reflecting, I remember that I used to get a lot of my satisfaction from these kind of consumption activities. And it ultimately felt pretty hollow. It was never enough. And, I was otherwise, I was developing an internal life. I've always liked to read and I've always been a spiritual person, but still there was something like it just wasn't quite enough. And now that kind of existential void is no longer here, right? After homesteading for a couple of years, we're still only producing a small fraction of our food, but to actually be part of, producing some of your basic necessities of life, there's something that you can't replace that. I don't have that existential void anymore. Like it's just gone. All of the meditation I was doing and everything I was doing helped to alleviate it a little bit, but it wasn't enough. It really was. And so I'm hoping, I definitely, like you said, you have to go through the Doomer before we go through the optimism. Part of our whole shtick is basically trying to convince people wherever you are, if you're in a city, if you're in an apartment building, start producing something, grow tomatoes in a planted pot, or get in touch with local farmers, start producing things, right? Whatever it is, crafts, wherever you are. Part of it is, even if you're in an apartment building in a city, like of course, everyone knows that's just that's not gonna, you're not gonna survive a collapse through that. But it's part of a paradigm shift, an internal spiritual transformation that I think many more of us are gonna have to make, and we're gonna have to make pretty quickly. I think we all agree with that. But it is possible. I'm definitely, I think, a case in point where, a person who did that, and so I encourage other people to start that process as well.
Yeah, and I think on this point, Jason, sorry, I think it would be interesting to hear, James, just maybe a little bit more about your process, because I think for a lot of us, it's just this crazy psychological process, and I want to be empathetic towards people. They don't, like you said, they don't really have a worldview that makes sense for this. They don't really know where to turn, and so I think it is like this kind of slow. I mean, even probably for you, you grew up rural, I'm assuming, like you were saying. There is like this foot in modernity that kind of messes with you a bit. There's some aspect that makes you maybe consumptive, or maybe individualistic, or maybe thinking that the answer is in, your journey, a lot of life of the mind. So I wonder if, we could talk through that process a little bit. I think a lot of people are going through that, at this moment.
I mean, one of the big problems with the modern world is that the language that it uses is extremely absolute, and it's difficult to look back in history and really work out whether or not people living in different times thought in the same way that we do about our time, in relation to thinking that it's the ultimate time and it's going to last forever. I don't really, I can't say, because this is sort of rhetoric, but I don't get the impression. One of the genres of literature, just a short digression before I sort of go off on that, but you were mentioning about people, getting in touch with local farmers and things like that. One first step I've said to people to advise is that the sort of genres of literature. I'm reading a book at the moment called Life in a Medieval Village by I think their surnames are Francis Gies, I think it is, but reading about just the average life of different time periods and realizing that ours is just way gone, that and also maybe you're not even starting growing tomatoes. Read how a tomato is grown and realize what it takes for there to be thousands of different types of tomatoes in the store prepackaged every day. Just realize, and then when you go to grow a tomato, I love this idea that people are well, if things collapse, I'll just grow my own veg. The learning curve for growing things is 5 to 10 years, really, till the point where you really understand things. So but the process, it's about like I said, the language of the modern world is extremely absolute. I mean, the fact it calls itself the modern world is the inherent implication, finally, we've made it to the time when everything's right, everything's great, this will go on forever. And if you're born into that, then of course, I don't think people can really be judged, because it's in a way, it's like being born into a cult, right? You don't know anything different. So you can't really be blamed for being out of it. So stripping away the layers and realizing the sort of in the Wizard of Oz, the man behind the green curtain, is I don't want to say a traumatic process for people, but it certainly takes some self introspection and real looking to actually see it. I'm not really sure about my own process of doing it. In terms of my own process of collapsing, I mean, one thing I would mention is that I think in terms of collapse, when people are talking about it, that you really need to emphasize where someone's at in life. So if you have a wife and kids and a stable home, your skin in the game is far, far deeper than someone who's just has a wife, and then someone such as myself who is just single. I can move around. I can basically pick up any job anywhere. Collapse for me is pretty tangible, nomadic thing if it happens on some bigger scale, where I suddenly can't do the podcast, which I'm somewhat expecting that this just won't be a reality in however many years, and I might have to go work on a farm or something. That's going to be a far easier process for myself than someone who does have a family. So when I talk about myself collapsing now, I don't have as many worries as someone who does have kids, because it's just a complete game changer. But it's the process. I know what you're talking about, the process of sort of beginning that questioning the modern world and realizing that it's collapsing. I think I've seen a lot of people who admit to it, but then just sort of apathetically don't worry and don't really think about it seriously. So they're like, yeah, that'll probably happen. You know, society's over. Well, everything's collapsing. And it's like, it's a big difference between realizing it in that very superficial sense. And because once again, it's the difference between collapse and collapsing. So a lot of people are just waiting for the event, and which would they think will be very cathartic. They'll wake up one day, they don't have to go to work because, I don't know, the whole financial system's blown up and fuel's finally too expensive. And so it turns into bands of roving warriors, where the reality really is right in front of us, which is like why I mentioned the energy rebate thing in the UK. It's like, yeah, the government is now admitting that energy prices are going up so much, but so much that actually for some people it's not affordable. Though personally, I do think that a lot of this is because a lot of people are using far more energy, like to an absurd degree. Same with actually the notion of poverty, which is pushed in the Western world, which I just think is absolutely ridiculous. But we can get to that. Yeah, so it's the difference between collapse and collapsing. People want that event. The reality is much more boring. It's much more drawn out. It is the reality of like one day you wake up and you go, I can't really do this job much longer because fuel's £2 a litre, right? And it's not, I can no longer drive there. And then you suddenly have to start thinking, well, I have to get a job nearby, and there might not be a job in your skill set nearby. So now you have to change your thing, you know, and people don't really want to play it out that way. They want the big thing. So start playing it out that way and see how anti-fragile you are. But one thing I think people overlook with fragility in supply chains, I mean, people think about food in supply chains, and we've seen with, for instance, the recent quote unquote shortage of the ability for people to not buy or get on credit. Obviously, get on credit. Actually, I think it's 92% of cars in the UK are on credit. No one owns anything anymore, even though everyone's scared of that. No one owns a thing. There was a supply chain shortage of the ores for the microchips for the new cars, right? And people panicking because they couldn't buy their new, you know, massive gas guzzling SUV, which they drive 2 miles to the shop every day or whatever. But one supply chain shortage that no one really seems, that I think is really the important one, is, as far as I understand it, there's some fairly rare things that go into medicines. And for instance, I mean, I think it's now 40% of the UK are on antidepressants, and anyone who knows that the drastically coming off antidepressants full stop basically causes serious problems. But you could also think of people who are taking heart medication or medication for epilepsy. I mean, just our fragile reliance on, if someone doesn't get a box of something for 1 month, they could probably die. And there's masses and masses of people. I mean, I would say in terms of you took the antidepressant thing, and then other people who are on heart medication, and older people who on various medications basically to keep them alive. You know, you're looking at 70% of most nations are probably on some form of medication. And that's really the supply chain that you think, man, that's only 1 month. That if people didn't have their medication for 1 month, there could be huge problems. And no one really mentions that one. I always think it's overlooked. Not to sort of do that bleaker than thou thing.
I think it's too scary of a prospect for a lot of us, right? Yeah. Well, let me shift a little bit. So there's kind of I'd say dueling memes and kind of the Doomer Optimism space. I think some people lean toward, like, in terms of aesthetics, some people lean towards cottagecore, right? This kind of like going, you know, returning to some idealized past, you know, as kind of rural peasants, but you know, with perfectly pressed clothes, and you know, everything looks beautiful. And then some people are drawn to like solar punk, which kind of seems like this hybrid of, you know, some kind of degrowth, but also, you know, retaining some of the, you know, the knowledge embedded in technology, you know, that will make our society kind of fundamentally different than, say, the Middle Ages. I'm curious how you see, you know, so let's say that, you know, we're facing a highly constrained energy future, and of course, our whole society runs on energy, including all of our products. But do you see, let's say, you know, 50 years out, Do you see us kind of returning with a V, return with a V, or do you see some kind of new hybrid that retains some aspects of technology, modern infrastructure, etc.?
I hate to say it, but I see a bit of both. So the one statistic that I love to tell to people when they go, sustainable energy, I go, to replace all the energy that just the UK uses, and we're actually fairly good. We're currently at 30% sustainable energy, which really surprised me. We're at 30% solar, wind, whatever. And we haven't really ruined too much. But to replace that other, probably roughly 65%, which is petroleum, we would have to cover 40% of our land mass in solar panels.
Yeah.
Which is like, so the solar punk thing for me, when I see those idyllic images of like, so that anime one for the yogurt advert where everything, I'm like, well, that's not how it works. Solar panels end up looking absolutely awful. There's wires hanging everywhere. They're garish and horrible. Like, yeah. And I think, so I don't really want that on an aesthetic basis, because one thing I would add in, and it was a brilliant thing that someone, I can't remember who said it, but so I can't take credit for it, but someone said, actually, forests aren't renewable, because once you cut down a whole forest and then replant it, you've lost that thing that you could walk into, and you've lost something that has grown holistically and organically over hundreds of years. You've lost that. And you can't just, you see all these replanted forests where they've gone like, right, 3 foot. It's not how a forest grows. And you end up with this horrible sort of thing. I get that it is a sustainable source, but equally the return thing frightens people, because it does buy into the myth of progress. Like, oh, we're returning, so it must be worse. But no one's really going to have a choice. So one of the good things they can do is try get themselves out of the myth of progress, the idea that going forward is always better, and realize that it's not a return in the sense of like it's worse. It's just we used to do things this way, and it works fairly well. And that's why as John Michael Greer emphasizes as well, read books about how people lived even in Victorian times, because the myth of progress has really instilled an idea that up until like 1980, with the invention of Reaganite capitalism, when the modern world came into its fruition, everyone was miserable and awful, and everyone hated life. It's like, no, most people were completely fine and normal, and they just got on with things. Like, people were still living to like 60 and 70 and being fine. And people going about, oh, they died really young. I don't think they really did. And we haven't really added that much life expectancy, and we're not really doing much with the life expectancy that we've added anyway. It was really the Industrial Revolution where the life expectancy went really down for some reason. Either side of that, it was I don't know. People have this sort of, I just really hate the fetishism of life extension. But we can get to that. But in terms of what you were saying about in terms of return and solar punk, the UK is really all I can talk about. We're already at 30% sustainable, which really surprised me. So, if the lights went out in terms of petroleum, I think we'd probably be fine with very vital services. And people would probably, even rationing to the point of, you get 2 hours of electricity a day unless you install a little wind turbine or something, or install some solar panels. Once again, it's sort of it's the chaos theory of that, of like, well, how does that all expand out once you don't have, petroleum's the thing that people really, like, no more plastic. Plastics is the thing that's absurd for me anyway. Every time, I buy some meat from the supermarket, when I do,
that almost imposes localism on you. You don't have, cooler supply chains and plastic to cover your meat. Like, that means you have to get your meat very close by and very fresh.
Yeah, and you have to do that. You have to do that every day, and you also have to get over the once again, the sort of fetishization in the modern world for not actual hygiene, but the illusion of hygiene, because something's clean and something's below 4 degrees, as if that means anything, right? Like, once again, just within living memory, I remember eating roast dinners at my grandma's, and she actually had a cold slab when I was really young. For anyone who doesn't know what a cold slab is, it's just a huge slab of stone, and you'd put your meat on that. You wouldn't have it in a fridge. That's perfectly fine. I'm starting to sound like Penty Linklater, right? Where he's like, I ate the moldy jam and I was fine. But there was a lot of stuff growing up like that when I was a kid, where people within living memory, living really deep in rural things, eating things and doing things that you'd never, eating unwashed veg. Nowadays and this has all caused a lot of harm, especially to our gut bacteria and things like that. but yeah, locally, I mean, it's almost like a good scenario to play through your head. Is like, all right, say in 5 years time, everything's not going too well, you have to live locally and work locally with 4 hours electricity a day. Like, all right, where are you getting your food? Like, if I live near the sea, I could probably go grab a fishing rod from the fishing shop and get some, I believe it's mackerel season, I think. They're fairly abundant here. But that's a bit idyllic.
Well, okay, so I think this is an interesting spot to maybe lean into the optimism, because I think on the one hand, it's really good to say, like, we need to do this so that we can avoid the worst risks or the worst impacts of the collapse of modernity or whatever. But on the other hand, there's something inherently appealing about it. That I've been having a really hard time articulating, because it's almost like something you can experience only. I mean, it's almost like people in the modern world are so alienated and disconnected that they like try to do meditation to feel something, but they could just go hunting and that would be the same experience as what they're trying to achieve with the meditation, if you understand what I'm saying. So
yeah, no,
I wonder if there is some way to like describe from your perspective that, like, I mean, the cold slab, the fishing, but it's not just practical. It's not just good for practical reasons. There's something about it, something like a belonging to a place and a time, and to interdependence with other humans and the natural world. Like, it's hard to articulate, but maybe you could.
It's extremely hard to articulate it, and really, it's what I've tried to articulate for a long time, and I've had to stop because I don't think I could do it justice. And I've sort of got an idea of how I'd like to in the future, like a very loose idea for a book I'd like to write. But really, it goes back for me that the process, what we're talking about, exit in terms of that, dropping out, it used to be called, and things like that. But people need to realize that firstly, and I think primarily, is an internal process. It's not always, you can go fishing on a weekend but still be absolutely plugged in and not connect with it in a certain sense. And this idea we've been talking about in terms of consumption, a lot of people like to say, well, so consumption in relation to consumerism, like these people in the city, and their whole life is a narrative of consuming various things to keep them basically like existing in their day. And people like to say, well, everyone consumes, right? And I used to say that, well, everyone consumes. But actually, I don't think that's fair. Like, the consumption under consumerism is the value system itself, whereas consumption elsewhere is a means to something higher, right? So you're not like going fishing and like, yeah, me and the boys are going on like a fishing experience, right? And it's like you consume the event of fishing. It's not that. It's really difficult to explain because you have to get out of that mindset. But one thing, yeah. So the way I begin to articulate this is my favorite little passage of Kaczynski, and I don't know it offhand, but just to paraphrase it, it's in the more personal stuff at the end of Technological Slavery. And he basically writes that there was a point when he was in his second year of teaching as the lecturer, when he was there for a very short time. I think it's second year, I think he was only there 2 years, but he was at the end, and he basically said, he wrote then, I'm going off to the woods, and even if I die, I don't care, because he'd truly seen what was in front of him. And I think for a lot of people, as we said, that as you said, the idea of mindfulness was something to sort of almost like just ram down what's right in your face, to give them eyes so that they could see, it's a fairly horrible process because you're stuck. So I remember having this process when I was in a marketing job. And it was, I'm not going to complain about the job. It was cushy. I was just sat at a desk all day in a air-cooled office in the middle of nowhere, selling various products for whatever. And I'm not damning that company, or, it was a really nice company, really nice boss. But you could abstract that just out to having this like modern experience. And I remember just sitting there being like, having an absolutely overwhelming internal feeling of getting there on a Tuesday morning, sitting there and just going, this is not life. This is not it. And, right now my job is now once again sat in front of a computer, talking to various people about things, but it feels entirely different because that internal freedom, which not everyone could get, the modern world is a bit of a horrible one for drawing people in and making it mandatory for them to have to, work in some sense to get by. didn't always used to be this way, I don't think, you know. And so, yeah, I know exactly what you're on about. It's extremely difficult to articulate, but it's often like this overwhelming internal cathartic thing of like, I have to get out of here. But it's like not the physical place, it's not the physical job, it's something in the mentality and the general modern atmosphere. It's like I gotta get out of here, and that takes a lot of work, because you realize to get out of it is like an internal prison that you've been trained to agree with. So it's like a very long process of scraping away presumptions, conditions, and default options of the modern world, and realizing there are anomalies and things like this. And, you know, that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of patience. It also takes a lot of self-introspection to admit, you know, that ultimately you were almost like initiated into this sort of modern cult of just bland lives. And yeah, and unfortunately, because the modern world doesn't really have a spiritual core, it's set itself up in such a way that I think a lot of people know that if they were to give that up in the way that Kaczynski did, or the way that we've sort of done in that internal way, that because it doesn't have a spiritual core, a lot of people don't have anything to go to. So you actually are going into this weird vacuum, and which is why I think a lot of people, when they like fully exit, they can sometimes go a bit mad. So it's almost like, just take it slow, have projects to be going into, because otherwise you are having that sort of like basically equivalent of a breakdown, you know, just like the Nietzschean moment, but he didn't realize God is dead. He's just realized that absolutely everything around him is valueless and false, which is, well, it was what he's realizing, but yeah.
This kind of relates to the concept you really like, Ashley, of dual process theory. Do you want to spell that out, Ashley? I could do it, but I think you could probably do it better in terms of exiting, but also like a foot in both worlds, and what are we doing in our exit, both spiritually and physically?
Yeah, so dual process theory is this author Morris Berman, and basically he just says like anytime there's a civilizational deterioration, things get so screwed up to the point that people are looking for alternatives. I mean, even if they can't access food or water, transport, they like figure this alternative out. So it's almost like a forced push. But I think it could also apply to the spiritual or internal too, where I think people are like anxious, depressed, like, unhealthy in so many different ways, and are at this sort of breaking point where this means nothing. Like all of this is all so meaningless. Everything that I'm told to do to gain success or happiness, and again, like just happiness as the goal, is also a weird thing, as opposed to like meaning or belonging or like productive capacity in the world as a mother or a friend, or it's like this thing where you're sort of pushed by the chaos, the deterioration to seek something that functions better, that's healthier in some way or another. And I think like that's basically the point a lot of people are at. What I worry about, though, that Morris Berman talked about, how in the collapse of Rome, there were a lot of these similar to Christianity mystery cults that were like similar in form, like people just trying to make meaning out of this like chaos of the order of the world in which they live. So my worry is that we're at this inflection point and people are like worshiping crypto, for example, and thinking like that's gonna get them out of this mess. And then they do really believe in it. And then it's like, the numbers are going up. Like I chose the right thing, this thing, you know what I mean? So I really worry about this particular moment. And I would really love to articulate, like, I wish I was a better writer. I would love to articulate in the strongest possible terms the meaningful alternative that's available to all of us in this process.
It's a very tough thing to articulate, because you're trying to instill in someone else a mindset that you've come to over a long time, and holistically, and something, it's the great problem of philosophy of being able to sort of convey to someone your internal process of getting somewhere. But as you say about, if I'm understanding dual process theory right, that having foot in both camps, I mean, I think that's vital, so one emphasis is to people, it's like, you can't just deny civilization. It is there. You can't deny these forces. It's super dangerous to do that. And you got to be aware of it in the same way that Thoreau was, right? He wasn't far from civilization, but he'd etched out his own place. Or someone like, he's a fictional character, of course, but Tom Bombadil in The Lord of the Rings, he's he's well aware of the world, but he sort of said, I think they speak of Tom Bombadil and they say like, he is of his domain, right? He's etched out an area and he's just the master and sovereign of it. But he's equally completely aware of what's going on in the world. But the beauty of Tom Bombadil really is where we all need to get, which is like when he puts on the ring, which we could take as a metaphor of all the power and greed and all the things of civilization. He's like, yeah, I remember this. And then just gives it back. He's the only person in Lord of the Rings who isn't overcome by it. Yeah. And, no one really speaks about this because he's in the world, but he's not of the world. And that's a long process because the world is extremely hypnotic in the way it sort of gets you to want things.
And they left him out of the movies, right?
Yeah.
I was pretty disappointed with that.
I was disappointed with that, but I think you would have been left sort of flabbergasted. I don't know how you'd have conveyed him, but yeah, he's a beautiful character, which I think anyone who's interested in the idea of the anarch or the idea of being a sovereign in their own world. I mean, Tom Bombadil is the case study for that, really. And you sort of just keep thinking back to him throughout the whole of the book. Like, what's this guy doing? And I really would emphasize that I don't think it's ignorance. I think he understands, maybe as we understand, that in a sort of a Spenglerian sense, you almost think, well, these cycles are just going to keep going. And I don't think that's a pessimistic thing. If you think that you're suddenly going to save everything and save the world and save everyone and create some Eden, you're falling into the same cyclic trap that we've had over and over and over and over and over again, right? That you're going to be the one that changes this, which is a very prideful, arrogant thing to do. And it's sort of like, actually, no, it's not pessimistic to say that. You look at history, we're meant to learn from history, but we don't want to learn from history that this too will end and then something else will grow up again. And that's how it is.
Yeah. I think I had this insight listening to one of your podcasts, but this idea that kind of recognizing civilizational cycles and that we're not on this constant linear trajectory of progress, it almost imposes on you an alternative, almost a transcendent source of meaning, right? A spiritual source of meaning. And I would like to maybe use this as kind of a segue to ask you about kind of, you're an incredibly well-read person, your life of the mind, your philosophical investigations, and then your recent conversion to Catholicism. How does that relate to, this notion of the anarch, of exit, is this kind of like your response to, is this your response to, everything we're talking about, right? Slow motion collapse of society. How does it work? How does it graft on?
Ooh. Yeah, it's a big question to tie them all together. I think one place I would start with that is the notion of hierarchy, and there being something above you that you don't get a choice, right? The modern world has tried to flatten everything so that everyone feels like they are all on the same level, and there's never going to be anyone above you. And to enter into an institutional religion, one of the monotheistic religions, is immediately to say, all right, as a priest, I've got to do what I'm told, right? Obedience. And that's a big thing. And you think, well, how is that, how does that correlate with the notion of the anarch, of the sovereign individual? And I think one of the key things of the anarch, really, in a sentence, is render unto Caesar, right? The anarch understands, like, I ain't going to change that. And there are things bigger than me. And there are things that, even if you're not Christian, you can be like, there's things in the universe that are going to, you don't get to control that. And it's really understanding that, and understanding that you don't have this complete illusion of like imminent choice where you can just do what you want is very key for the notion of the anarch. So it's sort of like religion first, and then the concept of the anarch. But it's it's almost like just knowing your place, which a lot of people don't want to because they've sort of developed this individualistic world where they believe they can just do what they want, and that's just not the reality. So the more you deny that reality, the more miserable you're going to be, because a lot of what is happening is that people deny, the modern world denies death, it denies suffering, it denies misery, or at least it tries to prove to us that these are things which not only are undesirable, but actually shouldn't be happening at all, right? Like, a lot of just generalized depression, I hate to say it, but it's like that there is suffering in life, right? You're not always going to be entertained and happy 24/7. That's not to push down people who have genuine mental issues, etc. But you know, and that's a key fact of life. And the more you deny it, the more miserable you get. But as soon as you accept, actually, there are bigger things than me, there are things that are out of my control, that's when you can start basically living. You know, it really comes down to the question of limitation. I think the modern world, one of the things the modern world wants to push, which is a completely illusory, of course, but it wants to really bolster this illusion, is that the human race has no limits. And it does this really by giving you an increased illusion of choice within the spectrum that it's defined. So it's like, look at how limitless we are. We're making so many more websites, so many more films every year, and look at the CGI, right? It's like, so if you're into that, it does seem like we're limitless, but on a very fundamental level, we have very clear limits. And if you don't admit to those limits, that's where the misery and the negativity comes in. But if you admit to limitations, such as like you are limited by suffering, you might be limited by your genetics, you might be limited by the fact you were born in a certain place, which is out of your choice. You are limited, in my opinion, by an objective morality, which people intuitively understand, but try to sort of jump through hoops to be like, well, no, here's why doing X, Y, and Z is fine. You are limited by that. And the more you deny it, the more miserable you're going to get, because you're denying reality. And you just cannot deny reality forever. Like it's going to, you know, if you could say, well, you can, but ultimately it is going to come and bite you in the ass when you die, because people are quite literally denying. People really just don't even want to know about it. And I think about this a lot, because I think about, once again, that reading about old times. I mean, for instance, life in a medieval village. I mean, one thing that, not to be too bleak, but I mean, this was the reality. So it's only bleak from a modern point of view, is that obviously no forms of birth control. And women will be having a lot more children, because that's just how it was. But equally, they would genuinely just understand that they are going to lose some children. That's just so common. And I think the minds and the mindset and the psyche, the difference between the modern one and a world in which death isn't like, oh my God, it's so bad, there's so much death, but death is, people die, you know, and it's like it's a fact of life. We try to say that to ourselves now, but we're like, someone's died, hide them in the hospital, burn them, and then we'll spread this abstract ashes thing somewhere. And we don't see the body. Very few people have open casket things. Just do not want to know. Same with suffering as well. So right, straight to the doctors, take all these pills, just, be quiet about it, basically.
You sound very Ivan Illich to me, who I just got into recently. And there is something, I think there's something paradoxical that comes from not only not denying these things, but embracing them. I mean, if you embrace that suffering is a part of life, if you don't embrace it, you're spending your whole time being so frustrated and anxious that you have any suffering at all. So all the time your whole life is focused on like, I should not be experiencing this. This is a mismatch from the way that I think, and your whole life is spent like, I need to push this down to the extent possible, as opposed to like realizing that suffering and death. I think about this on the homestead, like we're you know, I grew up in a city, but now I live here, and how much death there is involved in like livestock and animals and wildlife. And I mean, my cats catch mice all the time and play with their little dead bodies. Like that's just so normal. But I think in general, if you lean into it, something else opens up entirely, like a whole different conception about the range of emotions one can feel in life. And I think it's really exciting in some ways, because like embracing that you can feel like extremely sad, but then that opens up the door for like extreme moments of happiness too, because the whole time isn't spent in this middle where you're meant to be just content, I guess, cog in the wheel. Now I sound like Uncle Ted, but like, you know, I think this is the idea being, we're cutting ourselves off from like a whole range of human experience in the modern conception of how we should be and feel. That's not a question.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you know, as you say, death is really, what comes from that is an appreciation of life. And I'm sure in the cities there are dead animals and things laying about, maybe. But one thing with the country is, I mean, if I go for a 20-minute drive, usually it's like, there's another deer splattered over the road, because it's come face to face with the modern world, and there's a load of animals. And like, as you say, you know, living on a homestead, like, animal, you know, we even try hard as humans, we now try hide away anything that you could sort of consider, I don't know, like icky, right? You know, oh, I don't want to know about that weird bodily process and things like that. But like, you know, homestead is like, yeah, animal, like the nature, they don't care, you know.
I
Like,
mean, even
go,
reproduction and like helping an animal give
pull out
birth and
some
yeah,
gunky lamb that's covered in
I
blood
mean,
and shit.
but it's all of life is there. All of life is in that
Yeah.
moment, you know, and it's so full and it's miraculous. It's sacred, you know, and I think that a modern city person looking at that would be so grossed out, and it's like it's very sad. I think it's like such a sterile existence to be. I mean, not that I'm not grossed out and increasingly trying to like overcome it, you know, and learn like this is part of the fullness of the human and the experience of the human as like an animal in the world too, you know.
Yeah.
We've one of the reasons that we wanted to have you on is because we've kind of been talking more and more about the role of religion, and some of us in kind of this Doomer Optimism sphere are traditional, you know, Christian or something else, and you know, some of us, I think Ashley and I, you know, I guess I have a religious sensibility, but I'm kind of post-religious in a sense where I was part of a religion in my 20s. I was very serious about it, and I kind of got disenchanted with it. And now I'm in a place where, you know, I resonate with religious language. I pray, you know, I meditate. I feel like I have a connection with God, but I don't yet see how, you know, how it would manifest for me in kind of a physical, you know, community level with a specific set of traditions. And I'm wondering, you know, do you see like your conversion process? And you know, we're noting that, you know, Paul Kingsnorth also went through a similar process with, you know, his conversion to Orthodox Christianity. Do you see this as kind of normative? Like, do you? Of course, I think as a Christian, you know, it's almost your duty to spread the faith. But kind of from a philosophical perspective, do you prescribe kind of returning to tradition? Or there's also a lot of people who are like, we need a new kind of meta-modern spirituality or religion that incorporates or integrates the skepticism of, you know, modernity, and is more kind of self-conscious and aware and create some kind of new hybrid religion. And I think in the Doomer Optimism sphere, we kind of fall all over the spectrum, where some people are trying to experiment with that and explore that, and some people are returning to tradition. How do you see that landscape, and I guess what do you think about it?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I know from firsthand experience, firstly, that when I was 15 to 17 and a devout atheist, or a devout anti-theist, actually, that there isn't much, unless someone is already on their way there is not much one can do. You know, if A and B are contrary, you know, Christianity, atheism, there's not much one can really do to bring them around, right? You're already both beginning from your position, and it's two paths that go off into the world. And the reason the abortion, or these very serious debates around abortion, will never really be settled is because they're both coming at it from ontologically different viewpoints, and they can't ever synthesize. So it's like, it's just an impossible thing. But in terms of, you know, the overlap as well between this and collapse is very interesting. Actually, I'll bring in Lord of the Rings again, because I think it's just a fantastic place for metaphors. But, you know, one of the reasons I came around to God was because sort of sensing a lot of evil in the world. And it's quite funny to me that in Lord of the Rings, Tolkien emphasizes that one of the first things the orcs and the Uruk-hai do, and the orcs and the Uruk-hai are really just humans that have gone off the wrong way, right? So in the Christian tradition, evil can never create its own thing. It only ever takes good and mutates it, which is why the orcs and the Uruk-hai are like humans, but they've gone off, which is how I see city folk, really. It's like you're almost human, but something, your mind sees. So, but anyway, the first thing they do is they're like, you know, Saruman is like, just tear down the forest. You know, and then the film, this is like, you just sense this is the most evil thing, because you're just tearing all this down for the sake of creating your own thing, which is just more destruction. And I sort of think that's the sense of evil perhaps a lot of people who are doing the whole return to cottagecore or more of a nature focused collapse are sensing, is like, even to the point sometimes when I'm like, yeah, we do need roads, but sometimes I'm driving on a road and you see it as just this like great big tarmac knife cut through the forest, and you think, how beautiful would this have been without this absolutely horrendous, but people never question it to that level of like, hang on, could we live without roads and these horrible things called cars?
Maybe a donkey path that goes along the contour and doesn't, actually respond to the landscape.
Naturally there, and the donkey stops and eats, and it's all based around rushing around. And so, yeah, and so that sense of evil, I think, is where you really begin. And a lot of people will go off into various spiritualities. A lot of alternative spiritualities I see as buying into the modern thing of like pick and choose. And one of the reasons I went for Catholicism after all my experience in these alternative spiritualities is ultimately, if there is one God, then I don't know, it's speaking to a lot of people. I can't explain it too well because I'm not someone who's really going to push anyone in one certain direction. Like, if you found your spirituality, I don't think it's my place to step in. And
you're not going to tell John Michael Greer that he has to stop being a druid. And
exactly. I just think it's, no, I'm not. And I'm not going to, no, it'd just be absurd.
But why Catholicism? I'd like to hear more about how it resonates with you.
I think so as I sort of sense that even in the world, it's that has the inherent implication that there is a good, right? I mean, to take the road example, you can either focus on the road, or you sort of go, look at these trees on either side that we've had to push back, and this nature thing that, by the way, we have to constantly, it's not the road that we have to keep in check, we have to constantly keep in check nature, which is like, nature's always the thing encroaching, right? We'll never win that. So that and nature's, if people say, oh, nature's not beautiful, or something's gone wrong in their psyche, right? They're like an orc or an urukai. Go, I love industrial cityscapes. Sure you do. Yeah, all right, buddy. But nature's always the thing, the beautiful thing that we have to keep trimming, and we put a ton of resources in. I always find it absurd. It's like your job is literally just to stop nature growing for the sake of a road, right? So sensing that and sensing that that's the good, wanting to be on that side. And then I think through prayer, coming back to Christ was just a matter of personal prayer. And then in terms of specifically why Catholicism, I just saw it as the one true apostolic church. And I had a really great priest who sort of talked me through it. And I think for a lot of people at that point, it's where there's a lot of variables of why you might go certain ways. But yeah, and I mean, dispelling a lot of myths about Catholicism, once again from my priest as well, that it's not some like finger wagging, thing just telling you what to do. And it really is, it has a very long mystical tradition. It's extremely beautiful, and it also has a long tradition in terms of nature as well.
It seems like it also is conducive to more of an intellectual life than some other denominations, right? And like you wouldn't get in trouble for, all of your readings in continental philosophy through non-Catholics, and some other denominations might see that as more dangerous or something. I'm curious if that was part of the draw as well.
Well, I mean, that's still it's up in the air of whether or not I should be talking about certain people, but it's my job and I still enjoy it. So no, well, Anglicans would be completely fine with it, I think, but Catholics aren't too hot or happy about it, I don't think. But there you go. I mean, I do think there's ultimately, you can't just deny the world. Like there's ways to talk about things that are anathema to certain things, and you don't, I'm doing the talks on the tarot at the moment, and it's like, well, you don't have to actually divinize with them, right? It's like, these are symbols and you can just look into them. I'm not going to start tarot card reading.
Well, it seems, I think it's interesting that after all of your investigations into the occult and into esoteric philosophies of various sorts, that it led you towards Catholicism. That it seems like from that point of view, if it's the truth, then everything in the world that, both in the mental and the physical world would lead you in that direction. And so I guess if I was to like defend you from your priest or something, I don't know your relationship like that. Like that speaks well of the tradition that, such a person would would go through this process and be it, finally this is kind of like the final attractor point.
Yeah, I mean, that must have been God's will, right? Like, and when I look back, it's sort of somewhat clear to me that why it almost had to be that way. Because I assume it is fairly common for some people to go the other way, right? They're brought up in, often quite a constraining church for Catholic or Orthodox or Protestant domination, and then they still feel this connection to God, but they're like, oh, this is so stifling, and then they move out, and I went the other way, I guess. But it led me there. So yeah, it's a very peculiar thing to. I mean, my book, I'll push that while I'm here, I guess. My book, Be Not Afraid, is really a way to try and metaphorically articulate that process of going from the nihilistic modern world through to Christianity. It's not massively about Catholics specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think there's something really interesting in the Catholic orders, like the Franciscans and the Jesuits. And just recently, I've been thinking about Doomer Optimism as potentially being an umbrella like that. Like an umbrella, there's something really useful about having a pluralism inside an umbrella of, we have a certain set of values, but within that, there's like all sorts of traditions that one might resonate with more than others. I also think, like, in general, when it comes to religion or spirituality, just like homesteading or parenting or any of these things, like, you do have to just do the work yourself. I mean, you really just do have to find your path in it, and it has to be individual and not prescriptive from others. Like, I think it sounds like you found there's also something with religion in my opinion, that's a lot up to do with interdependence. It's a lot to do with finding the right people around you who are practicing it with you and the community that comes along with it. The relationship with the great priest is unbelievably important spiritually if you can find it, so you don't want to say, you go to your Catholic church and then somebody goes there and is like, this doesn't resonate with me. So it's not a good fit, interdependence or, for community for them. So that's why, I do think it can be pluralistic. At least that's my sense at the moment.
I think it's a really interesting idea. I mean, in relation to Doomer Optimism in this chat around collapse, there is a tendency within, I think, the collapse sphere to sort of shut ourselves away and sometimes be like, we're collapsing, you're not, sort of thing. And I was watching Tombstone last night, and it's interesting that Wyatt Earp rides into town and he sort of talks to the mayor, and the mayor says, well, this town's sort of got a gang called the Cowboys, and they all wear red. You notice a cowboy from a red bandana that they're wearing off them. And I was, in relation to what you're saying, it would be almost and in the relation of like Catholic orders, it would almost be interesting to have collapse orders, where you take not some ritualistic thing, but you take a vow in relation to a lot of values, and then you wear maybe a green thing, and then they're around the world, and you can go up to them and be like, how do I grow tomatoes, right? They're like bastions of collapse that are helping people out. And also, basically like a sign within the modern world that you're like, I'm within the world, but I'm not of it. You can talk to me about how to, a collapse priest or something, and they have to go through exams of how to learn farming.
Like a little symbol to know that you're in, like you get it. That you understand the critique, and then even within that, like there's
put a fish on your bumper on your SUV.
Yeah, but it can't be on the SUV. It has to be on your donkey cart, Jason.
Well, I grew up in the Bush era conservatism, and all the fish were on the big gas guzzling SUVs. So it's been quite an interesting realization that not all Christians are, neocons.
No, and it is a movement. I think there is, like James was saying, there are two things. I mean, one person sitting in front of the computer doing work is not the same as another person sitting in front of the computer doing work, and there is a chance to breathe new and different life into these institutions, I think, and there's a lot of hope in that. I mean, not just like for me, the institution of parenting, the institution, or maybe not even the institution, but the set of practices around homesteading. There are people who think like that is just so backbreaking, that's horrible, like that's serf labor. And then there's, the kind of way we're trying to practice it, which is, balanced and meaningful and joyful. For the
James,
most
are
part.
you thinking of getting on some land at any point? Are you interested in homesteading? Is that something that's
I mean, I'm interested in it, but the UK, I don't particularly want to move out of Norfolk, and land is obviously very hard to come by.
Yeah.
I've looked into it in like Wales. Like there's really cheap places in the UK, specifically Scotland and Wales. But it is the choice of like, if I move to one of those places, then I just say goodbye to like every friendship that I have, right? Like I don't know anyone out there, but it's still fairly affordable in a lot of places here. I mean, you can get sort of a good parcel of land and a small house for sort of between 120 and 180.
Yeah. Aren't allotments a thing? Like what is the deal with allotments?
Yeah, we normally, the way allotments, we still, I think we've increased a lot of allotments in the UK recently. Yeah, they're still a thing. And I think they're a good way of starting things. And I think we're slowly trying to remove laws about not being able to use your front garden and to grow veg and things that was like torn up in London. And, I wish more people would just dig up their garden and stop this stupid mowed lawn thing, right? It's like, or just let your lawn grow. Like it just doesn't, it's such a waste. But yeah, no, it's a thought, but once again, it's like money, time. Yeah. It's mostly money, right? Yeah. It's the problem. And the scarcity of land. Yeah. Things like
I mean, this is an issue that we've talked about a lot as well. And we kind of, I'll speak for myself, I kind of have two minds about it. One is like, well, just encourage people to do everything they can with what they have, right? Whether you have a porch and you have planters and just start developing skills, maximize your affordances. But at the same time, as what we predict that's collapse of current civilization will proceed, there will have to be some kind of sea change in access to land and people being able to to grow things at a scale where they can start being more self-sufficient. And this is a big issue because like a lot of one of the critiques that comes at us when we're posting pictures of our gardens or whatever is like, oh well, you're really privileged, right? You can afford these things. This is kind of like a middle class LARPing whatever.
I mean, it's literally the opposite privilege. Privilege is being able to sit in some cozy flat and just have someone else grow your food for you. Like that's the privileged anomaly of history.
Yeah, but it really I think and I see like these trends of private asset managing companies like BlackRock buying up all the housing and various the prices of land going up and up and up. And I just wonder when there starts to be more of a flood of people wanting to move in this direction, how that's going to work. And I'm curious if you all want to speculate on
well,
that.
I think when the flood of people comes, it won't be because they want to, it's because they have to.
Yeah.
So then the options from the governments and things aren't going to be so much like it's just going to have to happen. I think you'll just see more people at that point, like probably, like in Greer's Stars Reach, right? One of the things people are doing is just smashing pickaxes into old roads like all day, right? Mm-hmm. People may be digging up their driveways or their stupid patios that they've put up and realizing like, no, I need to eat. One thing on that, I don't think BlackRock is buying up all too much. And honestly, I would say within a year, I mean, the housing market's already crashing. The bubble's bursting. If you look at, if you follow like accounts where they track the prices, I mean, it starts at the really expensive houses, but statistically in the last like 2 months or so, all these sort of multi-million pound houses that are between $500,000 and about 3 million are going for like 10 to 15% below asking. So it's slowly coming down, and it's basically a repeat of 2008. And Michael Burry has also said, like, I tried to warn you guys. So really, you're going to see from that is that's probably within the next year, you're going to see a time when it's really good to get land. And BlackRock looks all that good, but ultimately they might end up in a position where they own a ton of land during the housing crisis and no one really wants to buy it. In the same way that if once the housing prices crash, more people are buying places. Anyone who's renting, I would assume landlords are going to have to take the price down because more people are then able to buy. So, and once again, back to the idea of cycles. And guess what we'll do after this? Once again, we'll find a new way to pack all mortgages together and create another bubble, and it'll go on and on and on and on, as it always does.
I need to hear, before we end, your thoughts on poverty. This term poverty.
Well, so I mean, look around my room and how I'm living. I live below the poverty line. And that's I eat fine, and I live in just a two-bed flat in a very affordable area where not many people particularly want to live because it's very awkward to live here. So my thoughts on poverty is that if you read, there's a great book by Dwayne Elgin called Voluntary Simplicity, I think. But he talked about it. He said he didn't want to call it voluntary poverty. But my point is that in the UK, for instance, they're like, oh, more and more people are living in poverty. But then if you look at the definition of poverty, it really is completely to do with how much modern stuff you can consume. So it's like, oh, these people haven't got these various appliances. And it's like, well, it's only poverty if you sort of choose it to be. And don't get me wrong, people who are homeless, who are like, literally, that's poverty. People who are living in their house and they literally cannot afford food. I mean, literally cannot afford food. That's poverty. But and this is, I don't think this is particularly me being conservative, but I've looked at the amount of the government amount that they give people who are on this line, and I spend like half of that on food a week, where their allowance is double that. So I think a lot of this is education towards the reason they're spending so much and their notion of poverty is so high is because they believe they need all the things from the modern world, and actually what the food they're eating is like, oh, well, I've got to eat have my Starbucks every day, or I've got to eat cereals or things like that. But it's like, well, if you get a bag of carrots, a sack of potatoes, some gravy granules, the stuff you need for a stew, I mean, that's not setting you back more than about $20 if you know what you're doing, and that will last you more than a week for a lot of that. So a lot of that is education, but it's because I think a lot of people would think, oh, a stew, what am I, some sort of middle-aged peasant? You know, and I think it's this notion of like, well, maybe you aren't living in poverty. I really do think this is the truth. It's probably one of my more controversial opinions. It's to do with what your assumption of the normal way of living is that makes you think you're living in poverty. And if you could remove that, you'd actually make a lot more people happy, I think. And I'm not saying everyone should just live in like, you know, squalor, but I don't think people are. You know, people are housed, and it's like, this isn't an anomaly of history that you can just go down the store and you're like, oh, I don't have like a fridge freezer dishwasher combi thing that I can do 3 times a day. You know, it's not poverty. You know,
Yeah.
I think it's absurd to me.
Yeah,
but
and
it's education, though. I think it is education at that point.
And like having a critique of rampant consumerism is somehow conservative now, where like, I don't know, I just like feel like it used to be a leftist thing to be like, let's save, you know, let's not buy every new appliance, let's not overconsume, let's not go to the store and you know, or go out to eat for every meal. I had a similar realization. I stayed in this tiny village in Yunnan province in China, and it was pristine. I mean, the village was beautiful, and I stayed in like this really old home, and they were giving me fresh vegetables. Everything was fresh. Everything, I walking distance to fields. There's like oxen fields, and there was like a sign up from the UN in the town that said like, the people in this town live on under $100 a day.
Mm.
But I was like, I mean, they're just living on the informal economy. I'm looking with my eyes. It's pristine here. It's so much nicer than it was in any city.
So they need that sign. They need that sign there. They need that sign to put you into a panic.
Yeah. Well, then I'm looking around, like the mismatch between the sign and the town, which was like one of the nicest places I was in China, was this town where the agricultural fields were tiny and right outside of the village.
Yeah, and then maybe we should start putting signs up in like intercity areas where everyone lives in like a 2 up, 2 down with a 42-inch TV, you know, a dishwasher which they've got on credit, and all these sofas and all these gizmos, and say these people are living on, you know, more than like £100 a week. Right. And it's like, look how miserable they are. And it's that discrepancy. The first time you see that, you're like, hang on a minute, you know, and it usually is the way. I mean, you look at the statistics of happiness in relation to earnings that the modern world has tried to quantify happiness. And it only fluctuates between a difference of 5%. And that's actually not the people who earn over 6 figures are more miserable. I think that the good threshold is about between £35,000 and £45,000 a year. Those are the happiest people. But only 35% of them are happy. The rest is like, it's like, don't do the happiness thing, right? Don't be looking for that. That happiness should be a symptom of the meaning that you're living in existence and existing. Yeah.
James, before we wrap up, well, one, I want to ask you the question of your show, the Hermitix question. 3 thinkers, living or dead, in a room. You could be a fly on the wall. 3. I know you used to do 5, and now you turn it down to 3, so you can choose. Who are those? Who are those people?
That would be. I was thinking about this last night. It's really difficult for me, but they're 3 people who are living at the same time, and they're probably in a way like the biggest influences. So, and it'd be a terrifying room for many reasons. So, the first one would be Ernst Jünger, Storm of Steel, and Omishville, and I just think a conscious individual, and also he lived to like 102, I think. So would be an amazing person to talk to. The second would be George Gurdjieff, spiritual master, who I believe probably did meet Jünger when they were in Paris together. But that immediately changes the room, because I would be like just on edge. You have this sort of, everyone who met him was like, something is up with this guy in a very positive way. And then the third, which really would turn the room for me, like would make me even more nervous, would be Saint Edith Stein, Saint Teresa Benedict of the Cross, who was, so Jünger was quite literally was a Nazi, but he wasn't in it, and then he later critiqued it, and he was clearly critical of it. And Saint Edith Stein died in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, not that Jünger would have even known. So it'd be interesting to have a conversation between those two, because I think in a way they're both philosophers, and they both would have been trying for something more. And it'd be interesting to see what Stein, a Christian saint, would say to Gurdjieff, who is this very alternative spiritual figure. She might be like, oh my God, who is this devil? But it'd be an extremely intense room. And I think mainly because I would know that I'm in the presence of a saint. So I'd probably be dead silent and just let them speak. Yeah, that would be my 3. If I was to add 2 more, if we were to go to 5, I've never met John Michael Greer, so I'd put Greer in there, and be nice to meet him. And then
two devils.
Oh, Greer's not the devil. Greer's too nice, isn't he?
Well, from the perspective of your saint.
No, I don't know if she would say that. I don't know. But then number 5, I don't know. There's too many to choose from, really.
There are, yeah. Is there anything else that you don't want to leave this conversation? A question that you wished we had asked you, or you wish somebody would ask you, if they weren't so dull. Anything else?
No, none of that I can think of. I think it's been fun. It's been good. I don't really talk. The irony is I don't talk about collapse. I still love talking about collapse, but I haven't done many shows on it recently, because probably, as you guys have found, it's super, super fun to talk about informally. But there's a point where you go like, I don't want to talk about it theoretically anymore, because once you've accepted like peak oil, it's like, well, no more theorizing changes this for me. Yeah. So and Greer has said this, right? He said the reason he stopped the Arcturus report was because he's like, I don't like. I've told
There's
you.
only so many things you can say, and then you have to just start living with the consequences of that realization.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think I'm much more interested. This whole podcast is basically in the contours of the optimism. Like, what is this process like for all of us to try to figure out what is worth living for, and what is that like, and what are the pitfalls, and how can we help other people if they're interested. James, thank you so much. This was lovely. I'm so glad we met.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you, James.
Thanks for having us.
Take care.
All right. Have a good one. Bye, everyone.